Welcome. This is Marc Steiner. Good to have you with us here on the Marc Steiner Show on the Real News Network. Now, you know, if you're watching the news, there have been strikes all across this country from teachers, especially looking in the South, West Virginia and Oklahoma. There's something bubbling in this country. Teachers are standing up and saying enough is enough. It's not just about their money. It's about the investment in education. It's about the children. It's about where we're going as a country. And also, the teachers' unions are one of the most malign unions in the country. And they're going after them to shut them down and kill them. Well, our guest today thinks differently. His name is Bill Ayers. And Bill, of course, was made known because he was in the Weather Underground, but when he came up, he went and got his graduate degree and became a PhD in education and taught at the University of Chicago for a long time.
If we don't unleash our imaginations, we're stuck.
So we're a leading expert in education. He's written numerous books. His latest book is You Can't Fire the Bad Ones, and 18 other myths about teachers unions, and public education that he wrote with Crystal Lauria and his brother, Rick Ayers. And this is Bill Ayers.
Nice to be here, Mark. Thank you so much.
So you've written a number of books. This is your fourth?
No.
Fifth? Sixth?
No. Keep going. I've written something like 14 books, and I've edited about 12 more.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
That's good.
And I'm not slowing down, so I plan to have a bunch more.
How can you slow down?
Yeah,
it's not time to slow down.
No, it's not time. I've only got that much time left. I have to keep putting one foot in front of the other.
Like Harriet Tubman said, keep on going.
Exactly.
Keep going.
Keep going.
Right?
Follow that star.
So this book and this struggle right now, I think is really very critical. And let me step out of the book for a moment, because we saw the strike in West Virginia. We see what's happening in Oklahoma. We see teachers standing up across the country in your hometown of Chicago. Right? They were the bulwark of the progressive fight in that city. So tell me what you think is going on here, what this battle for survival.
Well, first of all, I don't think anything happens in isolation. And I think the teacher strike in West Virginia, while it surprised everybody, I think it's a reminder of that old saying that every revolution is impossible the day before it happens, and the day after it looks inevitable. And when, it doesn't happen in isolation. West Virginia happened in the moment of Black Lives Matter, in the moment of undocumented and unafraid, in the moment of women rising up.
You see a connection?
Absolutely, because you take courage from those things. So people who've been pressed down and marginalized and pushed to the side suddenly look around and say, look, we've had enough, and we're going to do something. And when they stand up, just like every other movement I've ever seen, they begin to think more deeply. They begin to imagine a wider horizon. And then that leads, the people in Oklahoma said quite explicitly, we did this because we were inspired by the people in West Virginia. So we're seeing a wildfire across the red states. And these are states, remember, that are all right-to-work states. They're states that don't give unions much right. They don't allow collective bargaining. And it means that, collective bargaining, for all the other things that it does, it brings some labor peace. What you're seeing here is the opposite of labor peace. You're seeing wildcat strike after wildcat strike, and that's a wonderful and encouraging thing to me. And you also pointed out in your little introductory note that they're not fighting for something small and narrow. They're fighting for public education. You go to Oklahoma and you look at a state that schools meet 4 days out of 7, not 5. They meet 4. The other 2 days, Friday and Saturday, teachers drive Ubers and wait tables in order to make a living. That's an outrage. That's shameful in a country as wealthy as this one. I think I told you once before that my granddaughter's Chicago Public School, 4 years ago, they did away with the art teacher. 3 years ago, they did away with the music teacher. 2 years ago, they closed the library. And last year, they were told to bring their own toilet paper to school. Now, if that's not a big letter message to the families who rely on public education, I don't know what is. They're saying to families, if you can get out, move to the suburbs, go to a private school, go to a charter school, because these schools are not going to serve you any longer.
Enough is enough. Woo!
And the West Virginia, Oklahoma, Kentucky, and Arizona teachers are the first in this round to say, enough. We're not going to do that. Public education is an absolute human right. It's a community responsibility, and we're going to stand for that. I think it's great.
The teachers' unions and struggles around Chicago, San Francisco, Baltimore, Oakland, New York. So what's the connection? These are very disparate cultures, disparate parts of our country. What's the connection between them?
Well, the connection is, I think, a faith in public education, a faith that education really is a human right worth fighting for. I think the teachers in Chicago, who 5 years ago, led an incredible strike against a mayor who was certain he could crush them. And they beat him not just to a draw, they crushed him back.
What we see here is a teachers union that is fighting for the unity of community, students, parents, teachers, and the union itself.
And that union, it's worth noting that the Chicago Teachers Union, which was once a kind of traditional service union, a group of teachers began meeting at picket lines of parents fighting to keep their schools open. They met each other, they began to have a study group. This is about 8-10 years ago. In their study group, they began to read things like Naomi Klein. And they said, enough is enough. Let's run a slate. They ran a slate, they won. And then the state moved against them very heavily. They passed legislation that said you must have 80% affirmative vote in order to call a strike. And they thought that would be the end of the Chicago Teachers Union. In fact, they said this will crush the Chicago Teachers Union. Chicago Teachers Union got 95% vote 5 years ago to be able to go on strike. And they not only did they go on strike, but they went on strike with the full support of parents, which meant that every day for 5 days, we had 20,000 people in downtown Chicago at a rally. And even though they were only by law allowed to talk about wages and benefits, every banner said the schools need a full arts program. The schools need their libraries. We need counselors. We need nurses. In other words, it was a social movement disguised as a labor strike. And I think that's what we're seeing here. I don't think this is just a labor question. I think the conservatives high on the conservative agenda has always been crushing unions, and public sector unions have been in the crosshairs. And so we have in front of the Supreme Court a case called Janus versus AFSCME, right, which threatens to take what we now have 27 states in the union, our right to work. Right to work is going to be, or what we call right to work for less, is going to be the law of the land. And the conservatives may come to regret what they'd wished for, because what we're witnessing in West Virginia and these other places is what happens when you don't have an ordinary mechanism to air your grievances and to collectively bargain. You end up with this kind of wildcat. And I'm thoroughly encouraged by it, and I'm confident that it's part of this larger picture that we're seeing, which is resistance to the right-wing lurch that our country's going through.
So, whenever we talk, you have a very positive outlook on where things are going, where the movement's going, the
It's a genetic flaw. I can't help it. I can't help it. My mother was a Pollyanna. But
so.
And I must say, I've told you this before, but I'm not optimistic in the sense that I know what's coming. But I'm hopeful because I believe that people, when they have a pillow pressed on their face, eventually they fight back. And that's what I'm seeing now in a way that's hugely encouraging.
Well, that was the question I was going to ask. What we're facing, though, is diminishing funds for public education that adversely affects especially urban schools.
Chicago is the third largest school district in the country. This week alone, budgets were slashed by some $45 million at city schools.
What would be the strategy to fight that back and to turn that around? Because these huge forces arrayed against.
And the question of diminishing funds for public education, that's a choice. That's not an act of God. That's something, austerity in Chicago, what we say in Chicago is the Chicago schools are broke on purpose. Very much like the public housing in Chicago. 20 years ago they stopped picking up the garbage, and then they stopped fixing the windows, and then they stopped having police respond to calls for help. And eventually 10 years in they say, well, these places are uninhabitable. Yes, they are, because you made them uninhabitable. That's what we're seeing in the schools. So if you pretend that you have no money in a city like Chicago, and you refuse to bring in any revenue, and you keep cutting the taxes, Oklahoma is a great example. No taxes, no taxes, no taxes. That means no schools. So, we have to understand that it's intentional, it's policy, and it's based on an underlying kind of ideology that we have to be aware of. And that ideology is individualism unhinged, or one of the ways I think about in education is education a product to be bought and sold at the marketplace, or is it a human right? Article 26 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights says every kid across the world has a right to an education geared toward the full development of the human personality. Well, if you believe that, and it's not a product, then we shouldn't have to wiggle around to get a charter school, or we shouldn't have to get a voucher. I want a decent, fully funded, forward-looking public school that I can walk to in my neighborhood in Chicago. And the interesting thing is, those pushing the corporate agenda, those pushing the agenda of do away with the collective voice of teachers, privatize the public space, reduce education to a single metric on a high-stakes standardized test, those people all send their kids to private schools. So it's outrageous that they're asking us to put up for something much less than they would allow for their own children. So that's on the question of education. But I think the blow to labor is serious, but I think there's, hate to do it, but there's a silver lining there too.
Right. Where's that?
I can't help it. And the silver lining is that we've gotten used to, in the last 60 or 70 years, a certain approach to labor organizing, a certain approach to thinking about the organized working class in a certain way. And that has run its course, and the attack on it has been sustained and serious. All it means is that we have to find new ways of organizing. I'll give you an example from my world of education in Chicago. These teachers who organized parents, you know, when the progressive leadership took over the Chicago Teachers Union, they immediately let go all the people who were servicing the contract, and they hired organizers. And those organizers did two things. One is they went to every school and met with every group of teachers. Secondly, they went to every community and knocked on doors with parents. Something brilliant about that, something beautiful about that, because it's not the narrow self-interest of teachers that we're interested in. We're interested in the institution of public education. So they built the seeds of a social movement.
So I think it's about time for us, Bill, to kind of get to the book.
Okay. Okay.
We
Why
haven't done
not?
yet, right?
Why not?
You can't fire the bad ones. So I mean, and so even the title, that is one of the things they throw out at teachers all the time and teachers' unions. You have this contract, and that's why we can't get rid of you, Bill Ayers, you miserable teacher. You don't know what you're doing, and you're ruining our children.
Exactly.
But your union contract won't let me fire you. I mean, that's
exactly
right.
You got it. But of course, there's so many flaws even in that. I mean, first of all, it's not a union contract. It's a union board contract. It was negotiated between two parties. It's not something that was imposed on somebody. It's something that was negotiated, and I think that's critical. But the more critical thing is who gets to frame the argument. And for the last 4 decades, both political parties, the entire for-profit media, including the liberal media, the New York Times, the New Yorker, National Public Radio, the big foundations, the corporate money, has all agreed on a strategy for school reform, so-called school reform, that rests on this idea. I call it corporate school reform. It rests on the idea that education is a product. It wants to do away with the collective voice of teachers. And so anytime a politician gets to the microphone, and that politician could be Arne Duncan or Betsy DeVos, the last
you
couple
equate the two?
I'm sorry?
Do you equate the two?
Well, in this sense, the Democrats and the Republicans have walked down the same road around corporate school reform. And so while Betsy DeVos is indeed a monster, and a monster quite beyond what we've ever seen before,
I hesitate to talk about all schools in general, because schools are made up of individual students attending them.
I mean, she wants to do away with public education.
Right.
I think that Arne Duncan and John King laid the pavement, and so I think we shouldn't expect in education or in war and peace or in finance capitalism, we shouldn't expect the Democratic Party to lead the opposition because they've been part of the conspiracy. But there's a couple of interesting things that are worth noting. One is that even though they've had both political parties, and even though they've had, the major media, they have not won the argument. They've not put forward a moral argument that anyone can get a hold of. That is to say, tell me why we shouldn't have public education. Tell me why a kid born on the west side of Chicago shouldn't have a decent school right there. His parents shouldn't have to, run a marathon in order to get him into a decent school. That's the kind of thing that I think, and so we see opt-out, we see these wildcat strikes. That's the resistance to this corporate model, and I think it's important. But the framing of the argument is what we're fighting here. So anytime a politician gets to the microphone and says we need to get the lazy, incompetent teachers out of the classroom, I feel myself nodding dully. What am I going to do? Say, no, the lazy, incompetent one should stay there for my granddaughter. Of course not. I'm against that too. Right. The problem is that they framed the thing in a way that they win the argument. If I get to the microphone and say every kid in a public school in this country deserves an intellectually grounded, morally committed, well-paid, well-rested teacher in the classroom, I win that argument. And frankly, I think that's a truer argument. So one of the things we take apart is this idea of the lazy, incompetent teacher who just hangs around. One example we use is the New Yorker ran a several thousand-word essay called The Rubber Room a few years ago. And it was a lip-smacking portrait deserving of thousands of words about this room in the New York City Board of Education where folks who've been taken out of the classroom because they're so dangerous to kids that they can't be left there, but their case hasn't been adjudicated. So they sit in a room and get paid waiting for adjudication. And it is pretty horrible. And reading it, as I say, it's kind of a lip-smacking look at real pathology. And so, wow, it's a fun read. The problem is that's 0.00005% of New York teachers. Does it really deserve thousands of words? And by the way, they will get fired. They just have a right to due process, just like you do, just like I do.
Let's talk about what these myths say and what they can actually be when it comes to teachers' unions, where we need to go. I mean, some of the things you touch on here, the teachers' unions are the biggest obstacles to improving education we have today. That they're in the way. They're the ones making the problem.
Right.
They're not teaching our kids adequately. They cannot get our children to pass the tests because they don't teach them properly.
Right.
I mean, it's their fault that students are doing so badly on these standardized tests that they force down the throats of our system.
We cannot be held accountable for things that are out of our control.
If standardized tests is the metric that corporate school reform rests on, then okay, we'll listen to your argument. So they say the unions are killing the students and you know, their test scores are in the toilet because of the unions. Well, let's test that hypothesis. What are the states that have the lowest student test scores on the metric that the corporate reformers prefer? What are the worst states in the union? All the right-to-work states. So Mississippi, Alabama, Texas, Florida, West Virginia, Kentucky. Those are all the states where the test scores are in the toilet. Those are all the states that don't allow unions. So what about the states that allow unions? Let's take Massachusetts, where virtually every teacher is in a union. They do best. Okay, so you might say, well, there are other variables in Massachusetts and Louisiana, and I would completely agree with you. But I didn't make the assertion that it was the union that was the single cause, the single variable to break out. So I think that we have to take them at their word and then challenge them when we see that they're lying about it, basically. The other thing, and the reason we don't accept standardized tests as the measure of a good education, is the same reason that the elite don't allow standardized tests to be the measure of their little darlings and how they do in the world. But there's a thing we discovered writing this book that I've had a lot of fun with, and it's called Goodhart's Law. You ever heard of it?
No.
It's from economics, and it says something, I love the sound of this. It says, a performance metric only works as a performance metric if you don't use it as a performance metric. Yeah, I love it. If Medicare says the universe we're interested in is good hospitals, and the metric we're going to look at is if you survive major surgery 30 days. Every Presbyterian hospital across the nation, survival rates for 30 days were 99%. 31 and 32, you were on your own because people died then. Because the performance metric was easy to realize. What's hard to realize is a good hospital. So we have in Chicago a high school, and the universe that we're interested in is a good high school. And this charter school claims they send 100% of kids to college. That's the performance metric. Well, they do send 100% of their kids, their graduates, to college. But they push out in sophomore and junior year the kids who aren't going to go to college. And by the way, college is everything from Trump University to Rose's Beauty School. And by the way, those who go to the University of Illinois only last a year. So yeah, they send 100% to college. Is it a good school? You wouldn't send your kids there. So that's what we have to kind of resist, this notion that that the test scores are actually what they claim to be.
So let's talk about what needs to be then, and what about it takes these myths out. I mean, you're sitting in the studio now in Baltimore, Maryland, and a report just came out that said the Baltimore, and this is a union city, that Baltimore's test scores are at the very bottom of the nation, along with Cleveland and Detroit and several other places.
Probably New Orleans.
They're probably in there as well.
Yeah.
I didn't see they're in there as well. So, and the battle has been in the city about funding for the schools, which is completely inadequate. We have charter school system in Baltimore that's kind of taken over a lot, and the white charters in the city. The charters run by white people in the city, started by white people in the city, have all the money coming in because they know how to get to the money.
That's right.
Charter schools started by black folks in the city are getting very little money because they don't have access to the same power as white people do when it comes to accessing money. So it's a crisis, and our children in the city that you're sitting at this moment, where we're broadcasting from, are suffering from that. So let's talk about the myths that you raise in the book and how to turn those around for children in Baltimore, in Cleveland, and Detroit, and Chicago.
Right, and let's think about if we had access to the superintendent or to the school board, what would be the kind of questions we would want to put to them? If we had the power to kind of change things, what are the few things we could begin to change right away? And frankly, I think the first question really is what we were talking about when we began, which is, I asked Arnie Duncan this at a research meeting, is education a human right? And since you spent your whole life at the University of Chicago Lab School, and your kids go to that school, what have you learned there?
And your kids went there too, didn't they?
Yes, my kids went there, and
it's a public school. Be clear.
I'm sorry?
It's a public school.
No, it is a private school.
Okay.
And Arnie Duncan's kids went there, and Barack Obama's kids there. So it's a school for the privileged. And I said, what did you learn there that you could apply to the west side of Chicago? And he said that you're comparing apples and oranges. So he said, you know, we have to be realistic on the question of, is it a human right? I don't agree. I think we have to be idealistic, and we have to then get real about realizing our ideals. But yes, the first thing we have to start with is that school is a human right, and then we have to begin to address questions like equitable funding. And we have to, I think one of the starting points is to say, what do the privileged have for their kids that all kids deserve? And so Arnie Duncan, in charge of the nation's schools for 8 years, in charge of Chicago schools for 4 years, moves back to Chicago, can't find a single public school to send his kids to, even though he told the rest of us how these schools ought to be organized. So what does he have at the school he chose? A full arts program, class size capped at 15, and on and on. So, and a unionized teacher corps. So if that's good enough for Arnie's kids, it has to be good enough for the kids on the west side. And I think we have to demand it. And I said to him when I was having this little discussion with him, I'm not saying you could realize it this week or this month, or maybe even not this year, but is it an aspiration? And if you keep saying, no, it's not, we're going to have a charter school, we give you a voucher, then you're dodging the whole question. I mean, not only is Baltimore City in the toilet in terms of test scores, but it's also, we've re-segregated the schools in ways that are terrifying. And that's also not an act of God. That's also an act of policy. So I think, and Arnie Duncan was the worst on this. I mean, he used the word forced busing when he was, you know, I mean, you know, so here's a liberal, you know, so-called decent.
And that's a racist dog whistle.
Oh, it's a dog whistle.
Right.
So he used the word forced busing, which we all remember from George Wallace's days, right? So what I'm saying is, it's not an easy thing to solve, but conceptually it's not that difficult. It's not that complicated. So what we have to do is fight out the ideological questions at the same time that we fight for reforms. And this is no different than any other struggle you and I have ever been in. So Black Lives Matter kids, what they're raising in Chicago is they're raising, what would policing look like in a fair and just society? What would it look like in a free society? And they're willing to fight for body cameras, but that's not their goal. Just as Martin Luther King was willing to struggle for busing, but busing wasn't the name of justice. Right. His goal was justice. We have the same problem in education. We can get distracted by saying it's about one thing or another, uniforms or not uniforms, social promotion or not social promotion. No, it's about whether education is a human right. And we are willing to fight for a reform here and there, like community control of the schools in Chicago, which we won for a period of time. I should tell that story very quickly. You know, we fought 25 years ago to win local school councils in the schools, and we had them for 5 years. And that was elected representatives, 8 parents, 2 community people, 2 teachers, had the power of the budget and the power to hire and fire the principal. And the education establishment and the political establishment said, that's crazy. You're going to give the keys of the asylum to the inmates. Well, what did the inmates do when they got the budget? Chicago in 1 year did two things with those first local school council elections. One is we doubled the size of African American elected officials in the country, not in the city.
These boards.
These boards were elected, and they were publicly elected. We doubled the number of black elected officials in the country. And secondly, when the inmates got the money, what did they do? We had 3,000 more teachers at the end of that first year than we had before, because it didn't take rocket scientists to look and say, you know, Miss Adams needs an assistant in the kindergarten. We're going to use our money to hire an assistant. That was brilliant. It was local democracy. It took the mayor about 5 years to snatch it back, and we're still in a struggle. And in the upcoming mayoral election, one of the fights is over whether we should have an elected school board again. And we're going to fight hard for it, because we believe that the problems in a democracy, the solution lies in more, not less democracy. So that's where we're headed. But it doesn't answer the problem or the question completely. There is a huge job to do. The other thing you have to always remember is the schools reflect the society. You want to know what apartheid looked like? Go to the schools in apartheid South Africa. If you saw the schools, you would know what apartheid is. If you knew what apartheid is, you could figure out what the schools would be. Fascist Germany, authoritarian Albania. If you know the system, you'll know what the schools are like. So we have a big problem here, which is the inequality in the society, the hold of white supremacy over our entire history. That still expresses itself. So we can't pretend that we can just do the schools without doing society, but nor can we be in a position where we say we're not going to do anything in the schools until we have a just and fair society. It's interactive, and the schools are always the site of struggle in every society, because they represent the possibility of a different future. And that's why we will always be fighting about education.
And that's why Bill Ayers is here and there, because he's always at the heart of the struggle.
I don't know about that.
You are, but you've been there a long time. So
hanging on by my fingernails.
Ain't we all?
Yep.
So thank you, Bill, for stopping by the studio.
I'm thrilled to see you, Mark.
Really good to see you too, brother.
Take care.
So Bill Ayers, the latest book is You Can't Fire the Bad Ones, and he's here in Baltimore because he's speaking at Red Emma's. And I'm Marc Steiner for The Marc Steiner Show here at the Real News Network. See you next time.